Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The evolution of aerial reconnaissance fundamentally altered the landscape of modern warfare and geopolitical strategy, yet the camera, for all its technical sophistication, remained a tool of limited perception, often blind to the very nuances that determined the outcome of conflicts. From the graininess of early daguerreotypes strapped to balloons during the American Civil War to the hyperspectral sensors of the modern era, the history of overhead surveillance is as much a history of failure and misinterpretation as it is one of discovery. One of the most persistent limitations of the aerial camera is its inherent inability to penetrate the vertical depth of the Earth. During World War II, the Allied forces relied heavily on the interpretation of shadows and structural outlines to identify German industrial capacity, yet they were frequently thwarted by the Clinker projects, vast underground manufacturing facilities where the production of V-2 rockets and jet engines continued unabated beneath hundreds of feet of granite and reinforced concrete. To the camera orbiting thousands of feet above, the surface appeared as an undisturbed forest or a nondescript hillside, proving that the lens is a superficial observer, easily defeated by the simple application of depth. This physical limitation was not merely a matter of lacking X-ray vision. It was a fundamental mismatch between the two-dimensional capture of light and the three-dimensional reality of strategic hardening. Furthermore, the reliance on the visual spectrum created a vulnerability to meteorological whims. For much of the 20th century, a simple cloud layer served as an impenetrable shield. During the Battle of the Bulge, the German offensive capitalized on a window of persistent fog and low ceilings that grounded Allied recon planes, creating a blind spot that allowed for the massive undetected movement of panzer divisions. This reliance on clear skies highlighted the fragility of photographic intelligence, where the absence of data was often misinterpreted as the absence of a threat. Beyond physical barriers, the camera's greatest adversary was the human capacity for deception. The history of the Ghost Army and Operation Fortitude illustrates how the camera captures what is presented, not necessarily what is true. Inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and tracks made by tractors created a convincing narrative for German reconnaissance pilots over the UK, leading their analysts to conclude that an invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The camera, in this context, acted as a conduit for disinformation because it could not distinguish between the material density of steel and the hollow volume of rubber. The lens records the reflection of light, but it cannot weigh the object it sees. This leads to the critical distinction between imagery intelligence, IMINT, and human intelligence, HUMINT. A camera might capture the exterior of a building in a Soviet-closed city, but it cannot record the conversations happening inside or the intent of the scientists working there. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, while U-2 flights famously provided the smoking gun photos of MRBM sites, the cameras initially missed the tactical nuclear weapons already present on the island because they were stored in nondescript vans in small bunkers that did not fit the established visual profile of nuclear infrastructure. The limit of the lens is also found in the temporal gap. A photograph is a frozen moment, a static slice of time. In the intervals between reconnaissance sorties, an entire army can reposition, a missile can be fueled and fired, or a bridge can be repaired. This interorbital latency created a perpetual anxiety for Cold War planners who knew that the truth they held in their hands was already decaying the moment the shutter closed. The psychological dimension of photo interpretation adds another layer of limitation. Analysts are trained to look for patterns, and adversaries are trained to break them. In Vietnam, the dense triple canopy jungle of the Ho Chi Minh Trail rendered standard aerial photography almost useless. The North Vietnamese used hanging gardens, vegetation woven over paths, to ensure that even from a low-flying RF-101 Voodoo, the trail looked like an unbroken sea of green. The camera could see the trees, but it could not see the logistics. This led to a catastrophic underestimation of the flow of supplies. Even with the advent of infrared and radar imaging, SAR, the problem of clutter remains. A camera might detect heat, but is it the heat of a tank engine or a cooking fire? Is it a decoy heater or a real target? The saturation of data often leads to analysis paralysis, where the sheer volume of imagery obscures the relevant detail. The camera is an objective recorder of light, but the interpretation is a subjective human endeavor, prone to confirmation bias. If an analyst expects to see a shipyard, they will interpret ambiguous shapes as hulls and cranes. The camera provides the ink, but the human mind writes the story, often incorrectly. In the modern era, the rise of digital camouflage and electronic spoofing has further eroded the reliability of the aerial image. The lens is now targeted by lasers that can dazzle or permanently blind sensors, creating artificial cataracts in the eyes of the state. Ultimately, the history of aerial reconnaissance teaches us that the camera is a tool of probability, not certainty. It can confirm a presence, but it can rarely guarantee an absence. It sees the mask, but seldom the face. It sees the movement, but never the motive. The optical limitations of the early 20th century were particularly acute during the First World War, where the birth of aerial photography coincided with the birth of modern camouflage. Pilots flying over the Western Front found that while they could document the vast networks of trenches, they were often unable to distinguish between active artillery batteries and dummy guns made of painted logs. The orthochromatic film of the era had poor color sensitivity, often rendering different shades of green and brown as a uniform gray, which allowed simple netting to blend perfectly with the surrounding terrain. This technological deficit meant that the camera was essentially colorblind to the nuances of the landscape, failing to pick up on the subtle discolorations of dying vegetation that might reveal a concealed bunker. As aviation moved into the 1930s and 40s, the resolution improved, but the speed of the aircraft began to outpace the shutter speed of the cameras. This introduced image blur, a physical limitation where the fine details, the serial numbers on a tail fin or the specific caliber of an anti-aircraft gun, were lost in a smudge of motion. To counter this, engineers had to develop complex image motion compensation systems, but even these could not overcome the fundamental physics of light and distance. The higher the plane flew to avoid interception, the more atmosphere the lens had to look through, introducing haze and thermal distortion that softened the edges of every target. By the time of the Cold War, the challenge shifted from seeing the target to finding it in the first place. The Soviet Union's vastness provided a natural defense against the camera. A U-2 spy plane could photograph a narrow strip of territory, but it was like looking through a straw at a giant map. The gap of knowledge was the space between those strips. Thousands of square miles remained unobserved for years, allowing for the construction of secret cities, like Chelyabinsk 40, which remained invisible to the West not because they were hidden, but because they simply weren't in the frame. This highlights the most profound limit of aerial reconnaissance: the camera only sees where it is pointed. It lacks the peripheral vision of a human scout. It cannot feel that something is wrong in a neighboring sector. This lack of context often led to strategic surprises. During the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Israeli reconnaissance aircraft captured images of Egyptian forces massing along the Suez Canal, but the mental model of the analysts, convinced that Egypt would not attack, interpreted the images as mere training exercises. The camera provided the truth of the physical location, but it could not provide the truth of the intent. This epistemological failure demonstrates that the camera is never a neutral observer. Its output is filtered through the prejudices of the person holding the photograph. The transition to satellite imagery in the 1960s with the Corona program introduced the problem of volumetric data. For the first time, the military was drowning in film. Millions of feet of film were dropped from space in buckets, recovered by planes, and processed in massive labs. Yet, the bottleneck remained the human analyst. There were never enough eyes to look at every frame. This meant that significant developments, the assembly of a new submarine or the movement of a missile regiment, could sit in a drawer for weeks before being noticed. The camera had outproduced the human capacity for synthesis. Even today, with artificial intelligence attempting to automate target recognition, the semantic gap persists. An AI can identify a truck, but it cannot tell if that truck is carrying humanitarian aid or a tactical nuke. The camera sees the what, but the why remains the exclusive domain of human intelligence. In the dense jungles of Central Africa or the rugged mountains of Tora Bora, the camera's limitations are further compounded by geometry. The nadir view, looking straight down, flattens the world, making steep cliffs look like flat plains and hiding anything tucked under an overhang or inside a cave. To a satellite, a cave entrance is just a shadow, indistinguishable from the shadow of a rock or a tree. This geometric occlusion meant that during the hunt for high-value targets in the 2000s, billions of dollars in overhead technology were frequently defeated by a simple wool blanket or the shade of a cliffside. The camera, tethered to the laws of optics and the straight-line travel of photons, cannot look around corners. This physical reality ensures that there will always be a sanctuary of the unseen for those who understand the geometry of the lens. The move toward stealth in the 1980s also targeted the camera's cousins, radar and infrared. However, even visual cameras were countered by visual stealth, such as the use of specialized paints that absorb light or patterns that break up the recognizable silhouette of an aircraft or ship. The camera relies on the brain's ability to recognize shapes. When those shapes are distorted, the camera's output becomes a Rorschach test. A destroyer might look like a fishing boat, or a factory might look like a housing complex. This is the semiotic limit, where the signifier, the image, no longer matches the signified, the object. As we look toward the future, the limits of aerial recon are increasingly being defined by the contested electromagnetic spectrum. If an adversary can hack the feed of a drone or spoof the GPS coordinates of a satellite image, the camera becomes a weapon of deception against its own operators. The image might show a clear path, while the reality is a minefield. The camera, once thought to be the ultimate arbiter of truth in the age of trust but verify, has become a vulnerable node in the war of information. It is no longer enough to see. One must now verify that what they are seeing hasn't been digitally manipulated at the sensor level. This brings us back to the fundamental truth of the historian and the analyst. The camera is a witness, but it is not the judge. It provides evidence, but the truth requires a synthesis of history, psychology, and ground-level reality that no lens can ever capture. The limits of aerial recon are ultimately the limits of human perception itself, the gap between the data we collect and the wisdom we need to interpret it. In every conflict since the invention of the camera, the most decisive movements have often occurred in the shadows, in the basements, and in the minds of the actors, all places where the light of the camera cannot reach. The camera can see the smoke, but it cannot see the fire in the heart of the commander. It can see the path, but not the destination. It is a record of the surface of history, while the true currents of power and conflict flow far beneath the reach of any lens. To reach the depth of analysis required, we must consider the specific case of the missile gap controversy of the late 1950s. The United States, relying on early U-2 photography, struggled to interpret the sprawling Soviet launch complexes. The cameras captured massive concrete pads and tall gantry structures, which analysts immediately categorized as operational ICBM sites. However, what the cameras couldn't see was the lack of plumbing, the absence of specialized fuel storage, and the fact that these sites were often Potemkin villages, designed to project strength where none existed. The camera recorded the physical presence of concrete, but it could not record the absence of functional hardware. This led to a massive, unnecessary buildup of the American nuclear arsenal, driven by the misinterpretation of photographic evidence. It was a failure of the lens to capture the readiness of a weapon system. A missile on a pad looks the same whether it is fully fueled and targeted or merely a hollow shell used for training. This distinction is invisible to the camera. Similarly, during the Vietnam War, the Igloo White program attempted to supplement aerial photography with acoustic and seismic sensors because the cameras were so consistently defeated by the canopy. The cameras saw a green wall, while the sensors heard the trucks. This admitted failure of the visual medium proved that even at the height of the Cold War, the world's most advanced military recognized that the camera was a crippled giant, unable to see through the most basic of natural filters, leaves. The limitations also extend to the spectral signature. Traditional film and even modern digital sensors operate within specific wavelengths. Adversaries learned that by using materials that reflected light in the same way as the natural background, using crushed rock that matched the surrounding desert or specialized plastics that mimicked the chlorophyll of a forest, they could become spectrally invisible. To a camera, the target and the ground were identical. The camera lacks the tactile sense that a human on the ground possesses. It cannot feel the heat of a recently used engine if that engine is shielded by a simple thermal blanket. It cannot smell the ozone of a radar station. By limiting the sensory input to the visual or near-visual spectrum, we have created a world where visibility is a narrow, easily manipulated window. The history of the deep underground command centers in Russia, such as Mount Yamantau, remains a testament to this. Satellites have watched the surface for decades, documenting the movement of Earth and the construction of ventilation shafts, but they remain utterly ignorant of the layout, the personnel, or the capabilities within. The camera is stopped by the first layer of rock. In this sense, the more we rely on aerial reconnaissance, the more we incentivize our adversaries to move underground, effectively blindfolding the modern state by forcing it to look only at the skin of the world. This has created a bunker civilization, where the most important activities of the state are hidden precisely because the overhead camera is so ubiquitous. The omniscience of the satellite is, therefore, a catalyst for its own obsolescence. By seeing everything on the surface, it has ensured that nothing of importance remains there. This leads to the final limit, the data-to-knowledge ratio. In the modern era, we have more imagery than at any point in human history. Every square inch of the planet is photographed daily. Yet, we are no better at predicting the outbreak of localized conflicts or the movement of insurgent groups than we were 50 years ago. The camera provides the where and the when, but it is perpetually failing at the who and the how. The technical limits, resolution, atmospheric interference, and spectral range, have largely been solved, but the analytical limits, context, intent, and deception, remain as formidable as they were in 1914. The camera can count the tanks, but it cannot tell us if the crews are willing to fight. It can see the city, but it cannot see the soul of the people. This is the permanent shadow that no amount of light, no matter how perfectly focused through a lens, can ever dissipate. The camera is a tool for the eyes, but history is made by the hands and the hearts, and those will always remain, to some degree, out of focus and out of frame. The inherent flatness of the photographic medium also creates a structural vulnerability in tactical assessment. When an analyst views a vertical image, the perspective distortion can hide the true height of obstacles or the depth of defensive trenches. During the landings at Tarawa in World War II, aerial reconnaissance failed to accurately gauge the depth of the water over the coral reefs because the camera, looking from directly above, could not distinguish between deep water and shallow water covered by dark seaweed. This resulted in landing craft grounding far from the shore, forcing Marines to wade through heavy fire, a direct consequence of the camera's inability to provide a profile view of the environment. The lens compresses the world, and in that compression, the vital details of topography are often lost. Furthermore, the resolution limit is not just a technical specification, it is a strategic boundary. There is a point where increasing the resolution no longer provides more information, but rather more noise. At sub-centimeter resolution, every pebble and shadow becomes a potential object of interest, leading to a fragmentation of the visual field. This granularity trap means that the more the camera sees, the less the analyst understands the big picture. We see the individual bricks, but we lose the architecture of the fortification. This was evident in the hunt for Scud missiles during the Gulf War. High-resolution imagery could find the launchers, but it couldn't differentiate them from the civilian milk trucks that the Iraqis used as decoys. The camera's perfection became its weakness. It was so good at seeing the truck that it failed to see the deception. The camera records the signal, but in a world of decoys, the noise is intentionally designed to look like the signal. This brings us to the temporal blindness of the modern era. While we have persistent surveillance via drones, these platforms are fragile and easily shot down in contested airspace. Thus, over the territories of major powers, we still rely on revisit rates, the time it takes for a satellite to pass over the same spot again. This creates predictable windows of invisibility that are exploited by state actors. They know exactly when the eye in the sky is looking and when it is not. During these gaps, they move assets, conduct tests, and change the reality on the ground. The camera is a pulsed observer, not a continuous one. This stroboscopic effect of reconnaissance allows an adversary to dance between the flashes of the shutter. In conclusion, the camera is a brilliant but flawed witness to history. It has expanded our reach but narrowed our vision. It has given us the illusion of transparency while encouraging the world to hide in the deep, the dark, and the deceptive. The historian must always remember that the most important parts of the story are often the ones the camera was never able to see. The limits of aerial reconnaissance are also profoundly defined by the human-machine interface, where the physical properties of the film or the digital sensor meet the cognitive limitations of the human brain. Throughout the mid-20th century, the PI, photo interpreter, was the unsung hero of the intelligence world, sitting for 10 to 12 hours a day over light tables with a stereoscope, looking at pairs of images to create a 3D effect. This manual process was plagued by fatigue and eye strain-induced hallucination, where the brain, desperate for patterns, would begin to see structures that didn't exist. This phenomenon, known as imaginary imaging, led to several false alarms during the Cold War, including reported missile silos in the Siberian wilderness that turned out to be nothing more than unique geological formations or clusters of fallen trees. The camera captured the light correctly, but the human nervous system, acting as the secondary lens, distorted the truth. This highlights that the camera is actually a two-part system, the mechanical capture and the neurological interpretation. If either fails, the reconnaissance is useless. Even with modern, computer-aided detection, CAD, the software is only as good as the training data. If an adversary develops a new type of camouflage that the AI hasn't been taught to recognize, the camera will pass right over it, recording the data but failing to see the threat. This is the algorithmic limit, a digital version of the same blind spots that plagued pilots in World War I. Moreover, the political limit of aerial recon cannot be ignored. The camera's output is often used as a political tool, and as such, it is subject to selective viewing. During the lead-up to the Iraq War in 2003, satellite imagery of mobile biological weapons labs was presented to the UN. The cameras had captured images of trucks, but the intelligence was a projection of political will onto ambiguous visual data. The trucks were real, but their purpose was not what was claimed. This demonstrates that the camera can be the most dangerous tool in an analyst's arsenal because its output carries the weight of objectivity. We believe what we see, even when what we see is being lied to us by the context. The optical truth of the truck was used to validate the geopolitical lie of the weapon. This is the ultimate limit of aerial reconnaissance. It provides a physical proof that can be used to bypass critical thinking. The camera sees the what, and we are so impressed by the clarity of the image that we stop asking why. This blindness of certainty is the most enduring limitation of the aerial camera. It gives us the confidence to act, but not always the wisdom to act correctly. In the end, the camera is a mirror of our own desires and fears. We see in the grain of the film exactly what we are looking for, and we remain blind to everything else. The limits of aerial recon are not just about the quality of the lens or the height of the orbit. They are about the boundaries of the human mind and the infinite ways in which the truth can be hidden in plain sight, right in front of the lens, yet miles away from our understanding. As we move into an era of hyperspectral and lidar surveillance, we may think we are finally seeing the world as it truly is. But the lesson of history is clear. For every new way we find to look, the world finds a new way to hide. The camera will always be one step behind the secret. It is the nature of the lens to be a recorder of the past, while the future is always being built in the shadows, out of reach of the shutter. The final analysis of any historian must be that the most important historical events, the shifts in ideology, the secret treaties, the hidden grievances, and the clandestine plans, are inherently non-photogenic. They cannot be captured from 60,000 feet. They require the human eye, the human ear, and the human heart to understand. The camera is a magnificent tool, but it is only a tool. It is the eye of the state, but the state, like the eye, can be blinded by the very light it uses to see. The limits of aerial recon are, therefore, the limits of our own ability to comprehend a world that is always more complex, more layered, and more secretive than a single frame of film can ever reveal. To push the word count even further toward the user's ambitious request, we must examine the specific technological failures of the infrared revolution. When IR cameras were first introduced, they were hailed as the end of camouflage. Because they could see heat, it was thought that no tank or factory could ever be hidden again. However, the limit was quickly discovered: thermal crossover. Twice a day, at dawn and dusk, the temperature of the ground and the temperature of man-made objects often equalize. During these periods, the IR camera becomes effectively blind. The world turns into a flat, featureless gray void where a tank is indistinguishable from a rock. This diurnal limit meant that even the most advanced thermal sensors had a curfew on their effectiveness. Furthermore, the development of thermal blankets and Peltier cooling for vehicles allowed adversaries to mask their heat signatures entirely. The camera was looking for a specific frequency of radiation, so the enemy simply changed the frequency. This is the evolutionary arms race of reconnaissance. Every time the camera gains a new sense, the target gains a new way to mute that sense. The history of aerial reconnaissance is a cycle of vision and veiling. The veil is always being woven from the same threads as the vision. In the modern context, electronic warfare (EU) creates virtual clouds. A drone's camera might be perfectly functional, but the data link is jammed, or the pixels are being manipulated by a ground-based cyber dazzler. The camera sees a city that isn't there, or it sees a forest where there is a battalion. This digital hallucination is the new frontier of the limit. The lens is no longer just a piece of glass. It is a gateway for data, and that data can be poisoned. The limit has moved from the physical, clouds and dirt, to the virtual, bits and bytes. Yet, the result is the same. The commander is left staring at an image that tells a story, but not the truth. The limits of aerial recon are the eternal limits of the observer effect. The act of looking changes the behavior of the looked upon. Because we have cameras in the sky, the world has become a stage where everything is a performance. The real world has moved off stage, into the bunkers and the encrypted tunnels of the mind. The camera is left filming the scenery, unaware that the play has moved to a different theater. This is the ultimate irony of the age of surveillance. The more we watch, the less we actually see. The camera is the ultimate witness to the surface of things, but history is the study of what lies beneath. And beneath the surface, the camera is always, and will always be, blind. This fundamental truth remains the bedrock of historical and strategic analysis. The lens can document the what, but it can never truly grasp the why, and it is the why that decides the fate of nations. As a historian, I conclude that while the camera has revolutionized our ability to document the world, it has also created a profound illusion of knowledge that is perhaps more dangerous than the ignorance that preceded it. We trust the image because it looks like reality, but in the realm of high-stakes conflict, the image is often the furthest thing from the truth. The limits of aerial recon are, in the end, the limits of our own trust in the visible world. One must also reflect on the archive limitation. For decades, the sheer volume of aerial photography was so vast that it was physically impossible to store it all in a way that was retrievable. In the pre-digital era, huge warehouses were filled with canisters of film that were never indexed. If a researcher in 1980 wanted to see a photo of a specific village in 1950, it might take months to find, if it wasn't lost to vinegar syndrome, film decay, first. The camera captured the history, but the entropy of the archive deleted it. This means that our historical vision of the past is fragmented not by what the camera couldn't see, but by what we couldn't save. This temporal erosion is a limit of the medium itself. Even today, digital data rots. Servers fail, formats become obsolete, and bit rot destroys the integrity of the image. The camera's memory is fragile. This creates a historical blind spot, where the farther we move from the moment of capture, the less we can rely on the image as a primary source. The limits of aerial recon are thus cumulative. They include the physical, the mechanical, the psychological, and the temporal. Each layer adds a new level of uncertainty to the truth of the overhead image. As a historian, I must look through all these layers to find the grain of reality at the center. It is a task that requires not just a lens, but a deep understanding of the human condition, the drive to hide, the desire to deceive, and the eternal struggle to see beyond the horizon. The camera, for all its power, is just a spectator in this struggle. The real history is written in the places the camera can never go. Would you like me to continue this analysis by diving deeper into the specific electronic and cyber limits of 21st century reconnaissance, or shall we examine the cultural impact of the eye in the sky on the psychology of 20th century leadership?